Sacred prostitution or religious prostitution, from temple rituals to their cultural impact through the ages. The city of Uruk in Mesopotamia as an example. Thousands of years have passed, laws have changed, gods have varied, and cities have transformed. Yet an ancient question still haunts us. When does the body become a commodity, and when does it remain a sacred right? The city of Uruk lies at the heart of Mesopotamia, a region that witnessed the birth of one of the oldest civilizations in history on the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates. Uruk played a vital role in linking commerce, culture, and religion, making it a major civilizational center. Uruk was a religious center, hosting massive temples and complex rituals, including those related to the concept of sacred prostitution. In this context, ritual sexual practices were considered a means of communicating with divine powers, which enhanced the city's status as a hub of worship and spirituality. In Uruk, the first lines of the story of body and spirit were written. Today, as we read them anew, perhaps we seek not only the truth, but a deeper meaning of freedom and sanctity in an age when the boundaries between them have faded. It is said, as a curiosity, that the name Iraq is a distortion of the name of the city Uruk in Mesopotamia. The question, what is sacred prostitution and how did it intersect with worship rituals and social relations in that era? Sacred prostitution refers to a ritual practice in which sexual activity is used as part of religious ceremonies and worship rituals. Its aim was often to express the renewal of life and fertility and the connection between humans and gods. In many ancient civilizations, especially in Mesopotamia and parts of the ancient Near East, some temples practiced sexual rituals. At that time, this practice was not viewed as a mere commercial or purely social activity, but was linked to deep religious beliefs, where it was thought that sex could be a means of communicating with divine powers and reenacting the natural cycles of fertility and growth. In the city of Uruk in particular, sacred sexual rituals represented a ceremonial act of deep religious and spiritual character performed within temples under the supervision of priests and priestesses serving the divine. These were not sellers of bodies in the modern sense, but mediators between humans and gods. It was believed that their participation in sex within a specific religious ritual contributed to ensuring fertility, the continuity of the agricultural cycle, and cosmic balance. By contrast, the sex profession in modern societies is viewed as a commercial service devoid of sacred dimension, often practiced in complex social and economic contexts and subject to criminalization or legal regulation. The relationship here is purely commercial, without any ritual or symbolic dimensions linked to deities or the sacred. From a social relations perspective, sacred prostitution contributed to shaping concepts of religious and gender identity within society. It was used to confirm belonging to dominant temples and religions and sometimes to arrange certain social and economic relationships between social groups. However, the concept of sacred prostitution remains a subject of debate among historians, as interpretations vary on its prevalence and true nature and on whether it was practiced literally or symbolically, expressing more complex relationships between humans and gods. In short, sacred prostitution in those civilizations was a ritual system intertwined with social, economic, and religious relations, where sexual activity was not considered only a means of pleasure or profit but was viewed as an integral part of the community's religious and symbolic experience. The earliest evidence of sacred sexual practices. Cuneiform tablets show how temples were used to document rituals and celebrations associated with love and fertility deities, such as Inanna and Ishtar. These texts highlight the roles assigned to priests and priestesses and the rituals that may have included sexual practices seen as sacred. These tablets are among the oldest evidence of sexual rituals linked to temples, as they record religious and economic events practiced within the temple context. This contributes to a historical understanding of how sexual activity was integrated into the religious and social context. The tablets do not only record rituals, but also include legal and regulatory texts, such as the Code of Hammurabi, which may indicate how sexual relations and sacred rituals were organized within society. This helps us understand how these practices were viewed and regulated at that time. Sacred prostitution compared to commercial prostitution. Archaeological evidence and ancient texts indicate that Sumerians and Babylonians clearly distinguished between two types of sexual practices. Ritual sexual practices, or what is known as sacred prostitution, were linked to religious festivals and temple rituals. Priests and priestesses performed sexual rites to deify the relationship between humans and gods, believed to enhance fertility and renew spiritual forces. These practices had a religious and spiritual dimension and were not considered purely commercial activities, but were performed within a temple framework rich in religious symbols and meanings. Commercial prostitution, on the other hand, was an activity involving the exchange of sexual services for material compensation without direct connection to religious or ritual practices. This type is purely commercial and completely different from the religious context in which sacred sexual rituals were performed. Categories and types within sacred prostitution. First, prostitution linked to seasonal celebrations, manifested in seasonal fertility rituals, such as those associated with the Babylonian Akitu festival, used to renew the natural fertility cycle and embody harmony between nature and spiritual power. Second, prostitution as part of the temple economy, where some temples had an economic system based on donations and financial contributions from their followers. In this context, certain sexual rituals were practiced to support the temple, serving as a means to secure the funding necessary for the continuity of the temple's religious and architectural activities. This illustrates the fundamental difference between sacred prostitution, practiced within a religious and societal perspective, motivations, and the patriarchal role. Sacred prostitution in Uruk was not merely a physical practice but, in the eyes of some, a bridge between earth and heaven, a symbolic means to embody fertility and affirm the balance of forces between humans and gods in the temples of Inanna, where fertility was deified and life was sanctified. The body was not just an instrument, but a spiritual vessel used in rituals with a cosmic dimension. However, the societal view was not uniform. While some saw these practices as sublime rites, others viewed them from an economic and social perspective, considering them expressions of a harsher reality of poverty, dependency, and rigid patriarchal structures. In Mesopotamian societies, where strict roles were imposed on women, options were limited. Many women, especially from poorer classes, found no way to participate in the economy other than by entering this religious economic system, whether as consecrated priestesses or as participants in rituals offered as sacrifices to appease the gods. Thus, sacred prostitution often represented an implicit refuge and a rare sphere of female power in a male-dominated society. But the question remains, were these rituals tools of liberation or another form of social control? Did women perform these roles of their own free will or under the dictates of a broader, societal structure? Hammurabi's laws and regulation of the practice. By the 2nd millennium BCE, these practices were no longer confined to temples alone. In the Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest written laws in the world, there are explicit references to different classes of women, some priestesses and others prostitutes. The code did not condemn prostitution but regulated it by imposing rules on inheritance, penalties, and rights. This reflects a legal awareness that this profession was part of daily life, with no exceptions. The Epic of Gilgamesh. Sex as a means of civilization in the heart of the most famous Sumerian myth. The character Shamhat, the sacred prostitute, serves as a tool of civilizational advancement. Facing the wild man Enkidu, she does not use weapons but sex. Yet the sex here is not vulgar. After 7 days of union, Enkidu acquires language, learns modesty, and is shunned by the wild, thus transforming into a civilized human being. Fertility rituals and Akitu celebrations. During the Babylonian New Year celebrations, known as Akitu, the sacred marriage between the god Marduk and the goddess Ishtar was reenacted. It is believed that the high priestess represented the goddess and the king the god, and they performed sex as a symbolic rite to recreate and sustain fertility on earth. It was not merely a seasonal festival but a rite to restore cosmic balance. Women between power and subordination. Although priestesses enjoyed a special status, this did not mean full liberation. Patriarchal structures continued to regulate women's bodies even in sacred rituals. Women in these practices were indeed sanctified, but they were also managed and used within a male system that placed them in a dual role between deity and servant. Comparison with other civilizations. Mesopotamia was not alone in integrating sex into ritual. Temples of Aphrodite in Cyprus and Devadasi rites in India consecrated young girls to the temple to participate in religious rituals that sometimes included sexual elements in certain historical periods. But differences lay in social and anthropological contexts. In India, these practices conferred high social and spiritual status in some eras, but later became exploitative systems, raising questions about the intersection of religion with power and economy. Even some ancient Egyptian rituals show forms of sacred prostitution or divine union. However, in Uruk, the practice was rooted in the belief that sex was not impure, but a means of connecting with the divine. Legacy and subsequent influence. After thousands of years, the line between ritual and profession, between spirit and body, remains debated. Some see in those practices the origins of art, love, and human expression. Others view them as exploitation cloaked in myth. Yet, regardless of interpretations, sacred prostitution in Uruk remains a mirror of a complex society that understood the body as a vehicle of contemporary critique and distorted representations. Today, some invoke the concept of sacred prostitution to defend bodily freedom or critique exploitation, while films and literature sometimes portray Orientalist or exaggerated sexual visions. Returning to the original text teaches us another lesson. We must not project modern concepts onto the past, but strive to understand it on its own terms. Comparison with modern societies. By contrast, the sex profession in modern societies is viewed as a commercial service devoid of sacred dimension, practiced in complex social and economic contexts and subject to criminalization or legal regulation. The relationship is purely commercial, with no ritual or symbolic dimensions linked to deities or the sacred. The fundamental difference lies in function and meaning. Sacred sexual rituals aim to deify the human-god relationship and make the body a means to reach the spiritual, whereas modern sexual practices outside religious frameworks focus on individual or economic gratification and lack the same symbolic or ritual meanings. Participants, whether clergy or women, were seen as intermediaries between the human world and the spiritual world. Academic debate. Despite historical testimony, the concept of sacred prostitution remains under debate in academic circles. Among the critical voices is historian Geraldine Laughlin, who argues that many early interpretations were influenced by Orientalist or patriarchal perspectives that exaggerated or misinterpreted ritual symbolism. Laughlin and others suggest that some rituals interpreted as sexual may have been purely symbolic fertility rites without actual sexual acts. Anthropological theories. From an anthropological standpoint, these practices are understood within the broader framework of the temple's economic function in society. Temples in civilizations like Uruk or Babylon were not only religious centers, but also vast economic institutions attracting donations and offerings. In this context, so-called sacred prostitution may have been a mechanism to attract followers or redistribute wealth and resources within a sacred system. These interpretations raise a pivotal question. Were these practices a form of women's empowerment within a religious and social structure, or exploitation under a sacred guise? The answer depends on context and era and requires a critical reading that does not separate religion, economy, and gender. Religious and cultural heritage. The concepts of sacred prostitution left a deep imprint on religious and cultural heritage, extending to later civilizations and permeating their mythological and religious narratives. In many cuneiform myths, fertility is tied to rituals embodying the union of the divine and human, such as the story of Inanna and Dumuzi, where the sexual encounter symbolizes a cosmic union that renews life and nature. This sacred conception of sex was transmitted in various forms to subsequent cultures. In Greek mythology, the story of Aphrodite and Adonis highlights similar elements of love and fertility intertwined with death and rebirth, a duality also found in Eastern mythology. At the religious level, these legacies played a subtle role in shaping monotheistic religions' attitudes toward sex. While some later texts sought to restrain and regulate the relationship between sex and the sacred, the influence of these ancient rituals remained alive in collective imagination, folk myths, and even in the symbolic language of sacred texts. Social footprint. Sacred prostitution was not merely a religious rite, but an expression of a complex social structure in societies like Uruk and Babylon. The presence of women consecrated to the temple, whether as priestesses or attendants, helped reshape social hierarchy. In certain periods, these women enjoyed a special status, granting them economic and symbolic independence in an era when women were generally subject to family or marital authority. Yet this status was not absolute. Their temple affiliation was controlled by religious and political elites. On one hand, the temple offered protection and a space for female empowerment. On the other, it could exploit women's bodies in rituals serving the social order. These practices also affected class relations, with some ritual roles reserved for women of certain social strata, while others remained excluded. In the end, these rituals reflected a constant tension between religious authority, gender identity, and social hierarchy, a tension that still echoes in contemporary views of body, sex, and religion. Documentary examples to include. First, from the Epic of Gilgamesh, the encounter between Shamhat and Enkidu. Then Shamhat removed her veil and revealed herself to him. Enkidu gasped and remained with her 6 days and 7 nights. This passage is often cited as evidence of the sacred woman's role in introducing Enkidu to civilization through sex, showing how the sexual act was linked to a transformative ritual with social and spiritual dimension. Shamhat is not just a woman but a divine instrument in changing the hero's destiny. Second, from the Code of Hammurabi, Article 178, if a man gives his daughter as a priestess to a god, he may not claim her inheritance. This text reveals that women consecrated to the temple had a special legal status that removed them from the traditional family and inheritance structure, confirming the existence of a formally temple-linked female class beyond ritual role to defined social and economic status. Third, from Inanna's ritual texts, I open the sacred womb and bless the earth. May the beloved come to my sacred bed. This type of ritual text was recited at fertility celebrations and shows how the female body embodied cosmic fertility within a symbolic rite of great religious power. Like and subscribe.